having trouble finding scap wrap with an overhead shoulder position, so things like this, which can be very difficult to find if you haven't found protraction yet, which is scap protraction, driving your scaps forward. Can be challenging to do without even adding the overhead shoulder component. And a lot of times adding the overhead shoulder component, if you have a limited shoulder flexion, you might get pinching or pain when trying to do that overhead wrap. So here's a way to get started on the scap protraction and work your way up to that overhead scap wrap. Start by finding mind-body connection to scap protraction and really understand what that is. You have to make sure that your scaps are able to move and that they have strength and stability to help out your shoulders. So one way to do that is with scap cars. It's a great place to start. A lot of people are trying to find scap protraction when in fact their scaps are kind of stuck and don't move very well, so it's going to make it even harder to find. Other people have scaps that do move, but they don't have real adequate control of that. So cars will help you train both of those things, and it's just a great place to start to make sure that that scap is moving nice and well. So basic cars to start with is just coming up to elevation and then transitioning to protraction, nice, slow and controlled. Driving down to depression, coming back to retraction, coming back up to elevation, and then switching direction. Everybody there to really help their mind body understand it, and then I start to progress, because progressions are a great tool to have. If you try to jump into something that's really hard without progressing and finding an appropriate place to start, you're really cheating yourself. Because now you're doing something that's too hard and you can't do it correctly, and that's why you might not get the outcomes that you desire, because you're not really strengthening the weak area. You're using everything else to help. So start with something that's appropriate. So we start with those scap cars. We can also do them on the ground. So we're adding a little bit of body weight and a little bit additional feedback. Elevation, squeeze back to retraction, down to depression, and then drive your shoulder blades forward, which will push you away from the ground. You can also start to progress the scap cars by doing things like shoulder position, putting your shoulders out and finding scap protraction with your shoulders out at 90 degrees, and doing a full scap car here, and then bringing the shoulders up a little bit more and working through a scap car here. See what that feels like, and keep progressing your way until you get overhead with the scap cars. Okay, if you have access to a gym and you have a squat rack or some other sort of bar that you can hang off of, that's great. Otherwise, if you're doing this home workout, try to find a doorway that works well. So I like to get myself in a little bit of a squat, nice and stable in my body. And then I sort of lean back a little bit to get a nice stretch into protraction, passively pulling me there. And then I hold this stretch and I do some deep breathing, 360, pushing it out, in and out all the way around. And I hold that for up to 2 minutes. And then I add my isometric training. I'm in my passive stretch. I want to do an isometric contraction called PAILS, progressive angular isometric loading. So I'm going to strengthen the elongated tissue, which is important. So to do that, I'm going to try to come out of that full protraction, just start to initiate it. I gradually ramp up the intensity of that isometric contraction, 10%, 20, 30, 40, maybe 50, hold, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then I relax and I go into more stretch, and that might open up a little bit more range of motion for me. So PAILs are really great to do, and then we also can do PAILs rails. PAILs is that same thing we just did, and then rails will be strengthening this shortened tissue, the aggressive angular isometric loading. So PAILs was the same thing of trying to initiate starting to come out of this position, just slightly, gradually ramping up the intensity of the isometric contraction and then holding it for 5 to 10 seconds or so, depending on your training plan. And then as soon as we finish that contraction, we go right into the rails contraction of trying to drive into more protraction and holding that isometric for a couple of seconds. And then relaxing out of that, hanging out in a nice passive stretch. And then we would do some more passive range holds. So we try to really actively go into more protraction, and you'd start to feel a little bit of burning here because you can feel that working really hard. And then you can do passive range liftoffs, which are coming off the end range 5 to 10 degrees and then driving to end range, holding for a couple seconds there and doing some of that. After you've worked at this level of straight across, you can start to gradually increase your shoulder angle to higher and higher and higher, but you can only go as high as your shoulder capacity allows. So if you are limited in shoulder flexion, you're going to want to work on some internal external rotation and shoulder flexion exercises to open up the capacity of that shoulder so that going higher up for protraction exercises will still feel comfortable and you won't get that pinching or pain. If you get that, back off and just work at a level that is appropriate for you for the scap protraction.